Although New Orleans, back in the days when jazz was born, was the city of revivalist dreams, we were about to awake with a shock to its living musical reality. In 1949, a band was formed by a London train cleaner, Ken Colyer. It was called the Crane River Jazz Band, a harmless enough name, but it was to split the revivalist jazz world. Ken called his music traditional jazz. The war was on. Ken believed that the basis of revivalism, the jazz recordings made during the 20s by musicians who'd quit New Orleans, was a decadent development. He maintained that true jazz had never left the Crescent City. His idol was Bunk Johnson, an old and obscure New Orleans trumpet player, long retired, who was rediscovered in the late 30s. From then until his death in 1949, Bunk became a living legend. Ken believed this to be the true jazz. There was no other.
When I first cottoned on to Bunk, I admit I slavishly tried to copy him. But Bunk was a wonderful teacher, which I realized. It wasn't just to try and copy them, and it really is a waste of time just becoming a carbon copy of anybody.
Following Bunk's example, Colyer formed a strictly traditional New Orleans band as he conceived it.
And I had to drill it into them men. They weren't avid about the music like I was at the time, but I coerced them and influenced them. I don't know today whether it was ever to their regret, but it was my personality and driving force that made the band what it was.
You were a tremendous influence. Many musicians who'd been happily playing revivalist jazz moved over to playing traditional jazz.
Yes, but it's an unfortunate thing, in a way, that the jazz world became so partisan. I mean, it wasn't a good thing at all, but that's the way it happens. You had your avid people that believed only Louis Armstrong's Hot 5 and Hot 7, that was the only way to play, and so Jelly Roll Morton, that was the only way to play. And then there was all this conflict within the jazz scene, which was a shame, because conflict like that wastes a lot of energy and a lot of time that could be put to better use. You know.
Although you were in part responsible for that conflict.
Yes.
Russia in 1894, and I was fit for orchestra. I went with Adam O'Leary's band, my first band. Played with them just a short while, and I had the opportunity of hearing King Bolden's band at Lincoln Park. And I got crazy to play with Bolden, and Bolden played my style of music that I like. I like to read, but I rather play that head music better. More jazz. I like to read, I can read good.
Bill Russell was born Russell William Wagner when he decided to become a classical music composer. He dropped his last name as it was already taken by Richard Wagner. He was a leading figure in percussion music composition until he got bitten by the jazz bug. He became one of the leading authorities on early New Orleans music, making many recordings for his American Music Records label and writing articles and books, including 3 essays in the milestone book Jazzmen and the voluminous 720-page Jelly Roll Morton scrap.
We have quite a few photos here. This is the very first jazz band that became famous here. King Bolden.
Bill Russell wrote a 720-page book on Jelly Roll Morton called Oh Mr. Jelly. He also founded the record label American Music Records, which helped bring many forgotten New Orleans performers, including Bunk Johnson, to public attention, and he was an important force in the New Orleans jazz revival in the early 1940s. He moved to New Orleans in 1956, settling in the French Quarter and opening a small record shop from which he also performed violin repairs. In 1958, Russell co-founded and became the first curator of the Hogan Jazz Archive at Tulane University in New Orleans. Amount of material related to the history of New Orleans, early jazz, ragtime, blues and gospel music, which he kept in his French Quarter apartment. During his life, he was always willing to share access to the material with serious researchers. At his death, on August 9, 1992, he left the collection to the Historic New Orleans Collection, where it continues to be a valuable source for researchers. In his obituary, the Times noted, Russell was the single most influential figure in the revival of New Orleans jazz that began in the 1940s.
Since the 1930s, I've spent most of my life studying New Orleans jazz and writing about it and recording many of the bands. In 1938, I began working with friends on a book called Jazzmen and wrote chapters on New Orleans music. For 6 years, I worked at Tulane University as curator of the Archive of New Orleans Jazz. Through the years, I've kept files on as many musicians as possible. In 1957, I was very surprised to hear that Punch Miller had come back to town. I had been trying to keep track of him for years, looking for him in Chicago, hearing reports from jazz fans all over the country that Punch had been in a medicine show in Omaha, or someone writing that he had seen Punch in Montana, others thinking they saw him at a carnival in Wyoming. Then I got rumors from all over that he had died in Chicago. One day a friend ran in and said, "One of the greatest ever is back in town. Kid Punch Miller is back. He's just come by to pawn his watch." And I said, "Oh, that's impossible. I heard Punch died in Chicago."
To Bunk Johnson in Washington Square. He did much to promote the career of Bunk Johnson, but he wasn't slavishly addicted to Bunk Johnson's music, and I think he took a rather wider view of New Orleans music than possibly Ken Colyer did. And I don't think he ever said that it was the only true jazz music.
That's when you hear the kind of jazz you find on television only on our Jazz Party. New Orleans. You're here now among the men who made history, who started jazz in the cradle. This first portion of our salute to New Orleans we call the Buddy Bolden era, from 1880 to 1907. This was the beginning of jazz. Let's take a look at some of the faces, some of the folks who sort of grew up in that particular period of New Orleans history. See them and get to know them a little bit. For these are the men and one woman who helped make jazz history. There's, on our very fine piano, Sweet Emma Barrett. On the guitar there, we have one of our best pals, Mr. George Guino. See George over there? Emma, how are you today?
Fine.
Good, good. I think we ought to start the excitement right now with a little opus. If you can take your eyes off that racetrack sheet there and just tell me what you think the boys might start off with in fine style. Saints? Well, fine. With our salute to the Buddy Bolden era. Buddy Bolden was quite a man. I can't paint you a picture of him because, well, there's not even a very good photograph still available of Buddy Bolden, but he started what might be called all this jazz way back in the 1880s. He was a barber on Franklin Street. As I talked to you about him, I want you to see the faces of the people who were of his era, his time, for he was the most fabulous figure of all in jazz, Buddy Bolden. You don't hear much about him today? Well, it's been a long time, since the 1880s. So let's look at some of our musicians, see if we can see in their face a few memories of Buddy Bolden as I talk about him. He was a barber on Franklin Street here in New Orleans, played his first dance at Tintype Hall. At the end of the Spanish-American War, he was no longer Buddy or Kid Bolden, but he was King Bolden. One night at Lincoln Park, when Jean Robichaud had the opposition band in the park, and it was time for Buddy to play in another area of town, he stuck his horn through a little hole in the fence that was around Lincoln Park and just blew as best he could. He said, "I'm calling my children." His children heard him, and they all came and left Lincoln Park and poor John Robichaud all alone. So it went for many years for Buddy Bolden, up until 1907. Buddy Bolden's blues, Buddy Bolden's memories, Buddy Bolden's fame. The most fabulous part of all in New Orleans jazz history. Buddy's gone, but these folks you see sitting here today were of his time, his era. They listened to him, played with him, were inspired by him, grew up under the shadow of a man whose fame is almost forgotten today. But for this moment, it's bright once again. For this half hour is Buddy Bolden's He's as big a king right now as he ever was back in the 1880s here in New Orleans. I'd like you to meet two or three of the musicians right now before we go on to our next number. On clarinet, can we take a peek at our clarinet doctor over there? Mr. George Lewis. George Lewis has been playing for 51 years. He was born on Dauphin Street here in New Orleans, and at 7 years of age, his family was living behind the Hope Dance Hall. One day his mother gave him a 25-cent piece and said, "Go out and buy yourself a toy." He did. He bought a tin fife, and that led him eventually to his clarinet. It was at 16 he bought a second-hand clarinet. For a short period of time, he warmed up and got a job with a little band called the Black Eagles. He played his first funeral march in 1923 with the Eureka Jazz Band, and after that he formed his own band. Played with Bunk Johnson. He's one of the truly superb New Orleans clarinet men. He's toured Europe, and he's been acclaimed by all jazz critics as the very best, Mr. George Lewis. Over on drums, let's take a look at our good friend Paul Barberin. Paul, of course, comes from a very famous family. Played with King Oliver, Louis Armstrong. 1901, he made his first sounds, but it wasn't on drums. He was just crying. Now, of course, the fellow I want you to meet last in this portion of our little introductions is Punchy Miller. Punchy Miller was born December 1897. There he is. He studied with Jim Humphrey. Around the turn of the century, he played with Jack Carey's band. He and Jack worked out the fast riff, a little passage that has become the third strain of a tune that they called Jack Carey. Years later, this tune was introduced to the world by the original Dixieland Jazz Band, and you and I know it, this tune that he and Jack started. You and I know it as the Tiger Rag. He's the man who put the growl into the tiger. Back in 1923, Punch Miller, in a famous battle of trumpets at Italian Hall, was taken on by Sam Morgan. Sam beat him in the first battle, but second time around, a month later, in a historic rematch, they met again, and Punch Miller won with all honors, including $25 and a silver cup. It's a long time ago. They introduced him that night as Punchy Miller, and he's still known that way. Buddy Bolden, the man who started the era of New Orleans jazz. They wrote a song about him. Punch, could you sing it? You know, Buddy Bolden's Blues. All right. think I'll turn back to Emma just for a second, see if she's got an inspiration for us. What do you suppose we might continue our little party with, Emma? You got something in mind?
Careless Love.
Careless Love? I'm with you all the way. That's it. And I think if somebody will give the beat to somebody else, anything could happen right now. Yes, sir. Jazz party here in New Orleans, the Buddy Bolden era. These are the men and one lady who are bringing the era to life here in an informal setting in New Orleans. Punch Miller, Punchy Miller on trumpet. We have Paul Barberin, George Lewis, Peter Bocage, Slow Drag Pavigot, Georges Guénaud, Sweet Emma Barrett, and of course Louis Nelson. I think maybe now, just to prove that we have rehearsed this and that we're playing for fun, could we get together a blues? Any kind of a blues, George? Maybe you might give them the beat on it and the key, but as for that, we don't care. Just whatever you feel like playing. Have a little conference there. There's no rush. Bolden era, 1890-1907, the beginning of jazz in New Orleans. And now, in the person of one man, we have a thread that links us with Buddy Bolden in the past. A wonderful man, too. I'd like you to meet him right now. His name, Alphonse Picou, one of the giants of American jazz, a young man who is certainly over 18. Alphonse, how old are you now?
I stopped counting the years.
You stopped counting the years? Well, maybe that's why you're not really old at all, but very young. I know you started playing with the Accordiana Band in 1894. In 1897, you started your own band at Hope's Hall with George Moret's band. You played in 1913. You played at the World's Fair in 1913. Then with the Tuxedo Brass Band, one of the most famous. Now, let me tell you something very interesting about Alphonse. One of the reasons he is part of jazz history and will always be. He developed the clarinet obbligato to a march tempo, and that's what we call high society, one of the most famous of all jazz tunes. It's been a little while since you first played it. Do you think you could play it for us tonight?
I'm going to try.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Good?
Wonderful, Alphonse. You try. We're all with you.
Yes, I will please.
All right.